In the spring of 1979, a 19-year-old named Walter Kessler walked into the Marlette County Soil and Water Conservation District office in Lower Michigan and paid $7 for a piece of paper that nobody else in town thought was worth the ink. It was a field tile drainage permit, the kind of document that lets a farmer legally connect his underground clay tile lines to the county drain so that spring meltwater has somewhere to go besides his topsoil. 46 years later, that same $7 permit would be the only thing standing between a national logistics company and a $28 million distribution hub. This is the true shape of that story, told the way it deserves to be told. Walter's father, Elmer Kessler, had farmed 310 acres of sugar beets, dry beans, and corn along the flat glacial till plains east of Saginaw Bay since coming back from Korea. Michigan Thumb Country is some of the flattest farmland in North America, and flat land has one enemy that outsiders never think about. Water has nowhere to run. Without drainage, a heavy rain in April turns a bean field into a lake that will not plant until June. So generations of farmers up there built what is called a tile drainage system, rows of perforated clay or, later, corrugated plastic pipe buried 3 feet down, spaced every 40 feet, all of it eventually spilling into a county drain that a drain commissioner is legally required to maintain under Michigan's 1956 Drain Code. Elmer taught Walter how to read a field, the way another man might read a weather map. Walter could stand at the edge of a soybean field after a rain and tell you within an hour which quarter-acre would pond and which wouldn't, just from the way the crop leaned and the color of the standing water. He knew the difference between hydric soil, the kind that stays waterlogged and shows a gray or greenish cast called glaying, and well-drained loam that dries brown and crumbly. This is not folklore. Hydric soils form because prolonged saturation strips oxygen out of the top layers, which changes the chemistry of iron compounds in the dirt and literally changes their color. Soil scientists use this exact gray modeling today to legally define wetland boundaries under the Federal Clean Water Act. That detail matters because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. In 1979, when Walter took over the eastern 40 acres of the family farm as his own parcel, a wedding gift from his father tied to a marriage that never happened, he did what every Kessler had done for 3 generations. He extended the tile line. He walked to the Conservation District office, filled out a 1-page form describing the outlet point, paid his $7, and got his permit stamped by a woman named Doris Anhalt, who kept every carbon copy in a green metal filing cabinet that the district still had decades later. Walter's tile line ran 300 yards, connecting his lowest corner to the Kessler County Drain, a public drainage ditch that the county was legally obligated to keep clear under Michigan law forever, not as a courtesy, but as a statutory duty tied to every downstream parcel's drainage rights. Walter never married. He farmed that 40 acres alone for the next 4 decades, added 40 more when a neighbor retired, and became the kind of quiet fixture in a small town that people wave at without really knowing. He drove a 1986 International Harvester tractor until the day he died, patched with more welds than a farmer twice his age would admit to. He was, by every account from the people who actually knew him, unremarkable in the way that solid, competent men often are. He paid his taxes. He rotated his crops. He kept his tile lines clear by running a mechanical tile plow through them every decade or so, a routine maintenance right that Michigan's Drain Code explicitly protects for the life of the drain. In 2019, Walter sold the western 60 acres of his land to a regional developer for a modest sum, keeping the eastern 40, the original wedding gift parcel with the old tile line, because his mother's ashes were scattered along the fence row there, and he was not the sort of man to sell around his own history. The 60 acres changed hands twice more over the following 4 years, eventually assembled with 3 adjoining farms into a 210-acre parcel that a logistics conglomerate identified as an ideal site for a regional distribution and cold storage hub, positioned near a state highway interchange and within trucking distance of 3 major interstate corridors. The project was valued, once site work, refrigeration infrastructure, and rail spur access were included, at just over $28 million. The developers did their due diligence, the way developers do. They hired an environmental consulting firm to run a wetland delineation, satellite imagery review, and a national wetlands inventory check. The inventory came back clean. No mapped wetlands. What the consultants did not check, because it would never have occurred to them, was who held the legal drainage rights running through the property, because in Michigan, and in a number of other tile-drained agricultural states, a functioning county drain and the private tile lines feeding it are treated as a form of real property right that survives changes in land ownership. The tile line Walter installed in 1979 was never extinguished when the 60 acres sold. It was simply forgotten, buried 3 feet under a bean field, still doing its job every spring, the way it had for 40 years. Construction broke ground in the fall of 2024. Site graders leveled the western portion of the property first. And that November, after 4 inches of rain fell over 3 days, the remaining 40 acres that Walter still owned, his mother's 40 acres, began to pond in a way it never had before. The construction grading had altered the natural contour of the land, and more critically, heavy equipment had crushed a section of Walter's original clay tile line where it crossed under what was now a gravel staging road. Water that used to run off in a day was sitting for 2 weeks. His winter wheat drowned in the low corner. Walter did not hire a lawyer first. He drove to the Marlette County Drain Commissioner's office, the same office his father had walked into in the 1950s, and asked a simple question. Under Michigan's drain code, could the commissioner compel the developer to repair a damaged drainage structure feeding a county drain on private land, regardless of who currently owned the surface? The answer, confirmed by the county's own drain attorney within a week, was yes. Not only did the commissioner have that authority, the developer had an affirmative legal obligation to maintain drainage capacity for any tile connected to the county system, an obligation that predated their purchase and that they had in fact inherited along with the land, whether their environmental consultants had found it or not. The project halted while the County Drain Commissioner's office conducted a formal drain investigation, a process that under Michigan law can take months and requires the developer to fund repair or replacement of the damaged drainage infrastructure before further grading is permitted. Because the crushed tile line served not just Walter's 40 acres, but, as the investigation revealed, 2 other historic drainage easements that ran beneath the newly assembled parcel, the fix was not a simple patch. Engineers determined the entire western drainage network needed to be resurveyed and rebuilt to avoid repeating the failure, adding months of delay and re-engineering costs that the original site plan had never budgeted for. The story spread around Marlette the way stories do in small towns, mostly at the feed store and after church, mostly with some exaggeration. But at its plain core, it was true. A $7 permit from 1979, still legally valid, tied to a hand-dug clay tile line still doing its original job 45 years later, had given one quiet, unmarried farmer the standing to interrupt a $28 million project until the company that bought his neighbor's land fixed what they had broken. There is a real agricultural principle buried in this story that most viewers will never have thought about, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Farmland that looks flat and unremarkable is very often an engineered landscape, not a natural one. The upper Midwest's most productive corn and bean ground, land that now sells for $10,000 and $12,000 an acre, was mostly swamp and wet prairie 200 years ago. It became farmable only because generations of farmers like the Kesslers buried millions of miles of clay and plastic tile beneath it, an invisible infrastructure system larger by total length than the entire United States highway network. When people talk about the miracle of American agricultural productivity, they usually mean seed genetics or fertilizer, and both matter, but underground drainage is the quiet, unglamorous foundation that made the whole system possible. It also means that buried beneath thousands of acres of ordinary-looking farmland across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Iowa are decades-old legal rights-of-way that most current landowners, let alone city planners and out-of-state developers, have no idea exist. Walter Kessler did not set out to become a symbol of anything. When a regional newspaper reporter drove out to interview him after the county's drain investigation became public record, he reportedly stood in his barn doorway in coveralls and said that he wasn't against the distribution center and he wasn't looking for a payout. He just wanted his mother's field to drain the way it had, for 45 years, the way his father taught him it should. He said the $7 he paid in 1979 felt like a fortune to him at the time, because he was a 19-year-old kid with almost nothing, and it struck him as something close to fair that it still meant something all these decades later. The developer ultimately paid to fully rebuild the drainage network to modern specifications, added a formal drainage easement agreement with Walter, recognizing his tile line in perpetuity, and the distribution center broke ground again the following spring, 9 months behind its original schedule. Walter kept farming his 40 acres. He never asked for public credit, and by most accounts he found the whole episode a little embarrassing. A private drainage dispute turned into something people wanted to talk about at the diner. What makes this story worth telling is not that a small farmer beat a big company, although there is a real and honest satisfaction in that. It is what the story reveals about the layers of history sitting quietly underneath ordinary-looking ground. Every field has a memory. Every tile line, every fence row, every drainage easement is a record of decisions made by people who are mostly gone now. Decisions that keep exerting force on the present, whether anyone remembers making them or not. Walter's father dug ditches by hand before machinery made it easier. Walter maintained what his father built without ever expecting it to matter to anyone outside his own family. And when a $28 million company showed up with satellite surveys and environmental consultants, none of that modern due diligence could see what a 19-year-old farm kid and a $7 piece of paper had quietly protected for nearly half a century. There is something worth sitting with in that. Progress. Real progress. The kind measured in loading docks and refrigerated warehouse space, and thousands of new jobs, still has to reckon with the ground it is built on, and with the people who understood that ground long before anyone thought to put a value on it. Walter Kessler's 40 acres are still there today, still draining the way they were built to drain, still growing beans in the summer and winter wheat some years, still catching the same spring rain his father watched fall on that same flat, quiet stretch of Michigan thumb country more than 70 years ago. Some inheritances come in the form of land, or money, or a name passed down through generations. Walter's came in the form of a clay pipe buried 3 feet underground, and the patience to maintain it, year after year, long after anyone else had stopped paying attention to what was running quietly beneath their feet.